So I've heard about top miniature painters painting without using washes, so I thought I would test myself and have a go. It's coming right up.
Necrons!
Nick speaking, and welcome to this video. Right, today I am going to be showing you how to paint this awesome Nightbringer Proxy model from Den of Imagination. I've got a video linked up in the description below where you can find out all about this miniature and how you can get your hands on it. Right, so how are we going to paint this awesome miniature? Well, I had a bit of inspiration for a colour scheme. In my mind's eye, I wanted to paint this guy red and black because I thought it would be a cool combination and very different from my previous Nightbringer, which I've painted, and also, well, it should still look pretty menacing. So that was the idea. So with that said, I sprayed the miniature black, and then I got some watered down black paint and I just painted over the top of the primer. This filled in the gaps that may have been missed from the spray paint, but also because the spray paint black sometimes is different from the black paint out of the pot, it meant that the whole of the miniature was painted in the same black. So if I had to touch up the black whilst painting, then I wouldn't get two different black paints. So with that done, I decided to paint the base first because I knew how I was going to paint it. I was going to paint it exactly like I do all of my other Necron terrain and miniatures. Now, to be fair, this does include a wash, but I'm not going to be washing the actual miniature itself. I'm going to use a different form of shading. So the first thing I did is painted the rocks on the bottom with Caliban green, and then after that I painted the squares, the material coming out of the ground, the black stone as I see it in my black stone colours. So I started with Incubi Darkness. I did a couple of coats with this with a fairly big brush and with some watered down paint. I just built up the colours. I then used a shade, the Coella Green shade, and I only put this on the square blackstone rocks. That's the only place I put a shade on the whole of the miniature. Once totally dry, I then got the Incubi Darkness and I dry brushed over those blackstone cubes. Once that was done, I dry brushed Cabalite Green over the top of those blackstone cubes, and then once that was done, I dry brushed Sybarite Green just over the edges of those cubes, and that was the cubes done. And then when that was done, I painted the rocks on the bottom of the base with a warp stone glow. I just dry brushed over the top of the Caliban green. So now I had a good think about how I was going to paint the red on this Nightbringer, and as I said, I don't really want to use any shades when painting this because I want to try to improve my painting skills. So I did some test painting on my faithful Immortal. This guy's been painted sort of 100 times, but I did some testing and I came up with what I thought was going to be a good scheme. Before I painted the red though, I thought I would paint the energy effects on the miniature. So I got some warp stone green and I painted the energy effects. Now I did paint the little orb on the staff. I wasn't 100% sure I wanted that orb green, but I thought it might just look silly just to have the energy effects in his hand that bright green and everything else so black and red. In my head I thought it would work, but I wouldn't know until I'd finished the miniature. So I painted it all green and I did 2 to 3 thin coats. When that was done, I dry brushed over the top of the energy effects with mute green, and I painted mute green over the orb, leaving the warpstone green on the edges. Now this is usually where I stop painting on my energy effects. If you've watched some of my other painting tutorials, this is usually where I stop. However, I had a little plan for this because I'm only going to be painting this one miniature with this particular item in his hand. I mean, nothing else in my army is going to have this, so I wanted to try something different. So what I did is I painted Nurgling green over the top of these colours, again just a dry brush, just to give me that extra highlight, because next I'm going to use the technical paint Tesseract Glow. You've got to really shake this paint up, but once painted on over the top of all of those highlights, you get a really cool effect. Okay, so the energy effects are done and it's time to paint this guy black and red. So like I said, I'm not going to use a shade, I'm going to physically paint in the shadows. The first job though is to get some red on him. So I'm using Mephiston red and I'm going to mix that with some black. I can't remember exactly the mix, but I made it pretty dark, so it's a nice dark red. And then I started painting the red where I wanted it. Now in my head, this is what I was thinking. Paint the body red, the whole of the Catan's body red, and then add some red to some of the cloak areas, but not all of it. So the cloak went from black to red, but the body itself was red. So I painted just the body at first, and that looked pretty cool. And then I went in and I did some dry brushing on the cloak. So any areas that I wanted the cloak to be red, I dry brushed, and I also dry brushed some of the staff itself. Now I wasn't 100% sure how I was going to paint that scythe on the staff. It's like a huge scythe, but I was thinking it probably does need to be red and black somehow. So I just base coated the whole of the scythe blade in red and I went from there. Right, on to some shadow work, and this is where I thought I would test myself. Rather than using a wash, I could just black wash it and then re-highlight it. I thought I would paint in the shadows. So I got some black paint, I watered it down, and I started painting in all of the recesses, just spreading out the paint, what's called feathering the paint, so that it went into the red and I had a nice little transition. Now I do have a whole video dedicated to how to feather, so I'll link that up for you in the description below with all of my other painting tutorials. But I just gradually built up the shadows with this black paint. So when it came to the scythe, in the end I decided I would just shade it with some black. So I got the black paint and I put some in the corner of the blade and I just spread it out into the red. I just feathered it. I also went in the opposite direction on the blade's point, on the opposite side of where I'd put the shade at the top. The black paint is pretty thin, so it did take me a few coats to get that nice transition. So once all the shading was done, I was ready to highlight the red. I got my Mephiston red, but this time I didn't put quite as much black in. I made it more red looking. And then I got a small brush and I started highlighting. The idea again was to do some feathering. So I started where I wanted the actual highlight to be and I just feathered it across the red. The idea was I wanted a nice transition from light red to black. Now bearing in mind that red looks very different when it's wet and you first put it onto the miniature to when it dries. The saturation almost disappears. So you do have to do quite a few coats of paint just to build up the colour. So once I'd finished that layer on the body, I then got my dry brush and I used the same paint and I dry brushed over the red on the cloaks. I could have lined in the paint here rather than dry brushing, but the dry brushing I felt worked. It gave me a good effect and it was a little bit different from the actual body of the miniature. So when that was done, I got my Mephiston red and just a small amount of black, and as you can see on my wet palette I've got pure Mephiston red as well. And then I continued to highlight quite a few layers, just feathering in some of the highlights, first with the slightly darkened Mephiston red, and then once that was all done, I then went in with pure Mephiston red and I did the final highlights. I didn't highlight the cloak at this stage because I didn't want the cloak to be the same colour as the actual body, so I stopped highlighting the cloak at that second stage, but the rest of the miniature got these additional highlights. Once I'd finished, I had a good look at the miniature to make sure I was happy with the orb on the staff, and I was. I felt it balanced the miniature very well with the green at the bottom and the top of the miniature. So all I had to do was complete the base. I just added a bit of sand on the gaps of the base. I painted it black and then I dry brushed it with Dawnstone grey and I just painted the rim of the base. And that is the miniature all finished. I'm really happy how he came out. I think he looks super cool. What an awesome miniature this is. I really hope you liked my paint job. If you did, let me know in the comments box below. In the meantime, here is a video all about this miniature, and here is a playlist containing all of my other Necron painting tutorials.